What happened inside that congressional hearing room wasn't just another tense exchange. It was a moment that will be remembered as one of the most devastating political takedowns of the year. Senator Tommy Tuberville, confident as ever, leaned back in his chair and thought he could laugh away Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's questions about the military. A laugh, dismissive, mocking, and meant to silence her, echoed across the chamber. In that instant, he believed he had the upper hand. But what Tuberville didn't know was that Crockett wasn't just speaking as a lawyer or a politician. She was carrying the voice of someone who knew military service in ways the senator never could. With steady hands, she reached into her folder and pulled out a sealed letter. That letter, written by her father, a decorated Vietnam veteran, would strip away every ounce of Tuberville's smug confidence and expose his arrogance for the entire nation to see. The air in the room shifted. Reporters stopped whispering. Military. Families in the gallery leaned forward, and Tuberville's smile began to falter. In just a few pages, Master Sergeant James Crockett's words would demolish years of political posturing, reminding everyone that respect for service isn't earned through rhetoric, but through sacrifice. This wasn't just politics. This wasn't a soundbite battle meant for cable news. It was the collision of two very different legacies. One man who had built his reputation coaching football and talking tough about values he'd never lived, and one daughter whose life had been shaped by the discipline, sacrifice, and honor of a veteran father. And as Jasmine Crockett's voice carried her father's words through the chamber, the senator who thought a laugh could end the debate instead found himself silenced, utterly and completely. This is the story of how arrogance met authenticity, how mockery met moral authority, and how a Vietnam veteran's letter shattered a senator's carefully built image in front of the entire country. The fight in that hearing room wasn't only about words exchanged between two politicians. For thousands of military families across the country, it was about futures that had been put on hold, careers stalled, and lives upended by a single senator's political maneuvering. When Tommy Tuberville chose to block promotions for months, it wasn't just a procedural stunt. It rippled out into living rooms, kitchens, and base housing across America. Promotion ceremonies that had been planned for months were suddenly canceled. Families that had prepared to move to new duty stations were left in limbo, boxes half-packed, children pulled between schools they might never attend. Retirement plans, carefully calculated after decades of service, had to be delayed because replacements couldn't be confirmed. For some, that meant financial strain. For others, it meant months of uncertainty stretching into years. And then there were the children. Military kids already face unique challenges. New schools every few years, saying goodbye to friends, living with the shadow of deployments. Tuberville's blockade only made their world more unstable. Parents couldn't answer simple questions, like, "Are we moving this summer?" Or, "Will Dad get that new command?" That uncertainty seeps into every part of family life, making stability feel like a luxury instead of a promise. The economic impact was just as severe. Military spouses, already facing one of the highest unemployment rates in the country, found job opportunities slipping away because their family's future location was unknown. A spouse who might have accepted a teaching position or a corporate role couldn't commit without knowing where the military would send them next. The delay wasn't just inconvenient, it was financially devastating for families already stretched thin. And morale? It was sinking. Service members began questioning whether the sacrifices they and their families made were truly valued. Some career officers, after years of dedication, considered leaving the service altogether, calculating that the uncertainty was too great a price to pay. Every delay in a promotion wasn't just paperwork. It was a signal to the people wearing the uniform that their loyalty could be traded away for political points. The consequences reached far beyond family life. Without confirmed leaders in key positions, military readiness itself was at risk. Bases couldn't proceed with renovations, new strategies were stalled, and units went without the stability of permanent commanders. The ripple effect was national, security itself being weakened, all while families bore the brunt of the disruption. That's why this hearing mattered so much. When Jasmine Crockett sat across from Tommy Tuberville, she wasn't just defending her own credibility. She was speaking for every spouse left waiting, every child caught in limbo, and every service member forced to wonder if their years of sacrifice still meant something. The stakes weren't abstract. They were heartbreakingly real. Senator Tommy Tuberville didn't walk into that hearing room looking rattled. At 69 years old, With decades of public life behind him, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had always been treated as the authority in the room. To his supporters, the former Auburn football coach turned Alabama senator embodies discipline, leadership, and old-fashioned grit. For years he sold himself as the straight-talking defender of military values, someone who claims to know what it takes to train, to sacrifice, to lead. It's not hard to see why that image resonates back home. In Alabama, Tuberville is remembered less as a politician and more as the man who paced the sidelines on Saturday afternoons, rallying young players in front of roaring crowds. That football pedigree gave him instant credibility with rural voters, who saw in him the same toughness and discipline they associated with military service. The whistle around his neck may not have been the stripes of a uniform, but in the minds of many, it represented the same values: hard work, loyalty, and strength. Tuberville leaned into that comparison when he arrived in Washington. He painted himself as a champion of the troops, a senator unafraid to take tough stands and hold the line for what he believed in. His rhetoric was peppered with football metaphors, strategy, toughness, winning, and his folksy conversational style often disarmed critics in committee hearings. That charm allowed him to deflect attacks with a grin, a drawl, and a story from his coaching days. To his base, it looked like authenticity. To his colleagues, it often felt like theater. But here's the contradiction that would soon haunt him. For all his military talk, Tuberville never served a single day in uniform. His understanding of the armed forces didn't come from deployments, combat, or even base life. It came from the sidelines of football fields, from coaching young men, some of whom had served before stepping onto the gridiron. And while there's dignity in that work, it's a far cry from leading soldiers into battle or standing beside families waiting for loved ones to return from war. That gap between rhetoric and reality had always been there. But until this hearing, few had forced him to confront it head-on. Tuberville had made a name for himself precisely because he was willing to double down when challenged. When veterans organizations criticized him for holding up hundreds of military promotions, he didn't blink. When military families pleaded about canceled ceremonies and stalled careers, he dismissed them as inconveniences. His whole political brand rested on never backing down, even when he was wrong. It was that overconfidence, that belief that charm and bravado could shield him, that made him underestimate Jasmine Crockett. He thought his grin and a mocking laugh could silence her. What he didn't realize was that arrogance had set him up for a fall that no football playbook could ever prepare him for. On the other side of the committee table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old Democrat from Texas whose rise in politics has been nothing short of remarkable. Unlike Tuberville, whose reputation came from the sidelines of a football field, Crockett built hers in courtrooms where the stakes were measured in rights, freedoms, and the lives of people who depended on her to fight. Before she ever set foot in the House of Representatives, she had already made a name for herself as a sharp civil rights attorney, someone who prepared her cases meticulously, argued them with precision, and never backed away from a fight, no matter how powerful her opponent. Colleagues quickly learned that Crockett was not the kind of lawmaker to be caught off guard. Every question she asked in hearings was backed by hours of research, every statement cross-checked against data and testimony. She carried the discipline of an attorney into politics, which meant she wasn't simply performing for cameras. She was building cases, point by point, until her arguments landed with devastating clarity. That reputation for preparation and fearlessness made her one of the fastest rising voices in the House. But what most people in Washington didn't fully appreciate, and what Tuberville certainly hadn't calculated, was that Crockett's drive on military issues wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. She had grown up as the daughter of Master Sergeant James Crockett, a decorated Vietnam veteran who had served 3 tours and retired after 22 years in the United States Air Force. His stories of sacrifice and his lessons about honor weren't abstract to her. They were the fabric of her childhood. As a military child, Crockett knew the realities that families faced, the constant relocations, the late-night phone calls from halfway around the world, the silent dinners when worry hung heavier than words. She understood how promotions weren't just ceremonial. They meant stability, housing, education for children, and dignity for spouses who carried the invisible burdens of service. Those insights weren't learned from policy memos or committee briefings. They lived day after day in her own home. Her father taught her that service meant more than a title. It meant sacrifice measured in sleepless nights, missed birthdays, and the quiet resilience of families who endure it all. When Tuberville laughed at her, dismissing her knowledge of military life, he wasn't just underestimating a lawyer or a politician. He was underestimating a daughter shaped by decades of real military service, a woman whose very identity carried the weight of her father's combat experience. That's what gave Crockett her edge. Her authority didn't come from borrowed rhetoric or political posturing. It came from authenticity, from lived experience, from being raised to know that military families deserve respect, not mockery. Tuberville thought he was facing another partisan opponent. What he faced instead was a congresswoman whose words carried not only her own convictions, but the voice of a veteran father who had already earned the right to be heard. By the time Crockett's turn came to speak, the atmosphere inside the hearing room was already heavy with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled, not just by staffers or reporters, but by the very people whose lives were most directly affected. Military spouses clutching binders of paperwork, veterans wearing pins that told silent stories, and gold. Star families carrying photographs of loved ones who never made it home. For them, this wasn't abstract policy debate. It was their future, their children's security, their sense that sacrifice should be honored rather than toyed with. Tuberville had already stoked the fire earlier that morning. When Representative Martinez pressed him on delayed medical benefits for military spouses, he brushed it off with a grin, joking that military wives are tougher than most folks think. Laughter rippled from his allies, but in the gallery, jaws tightened. A few seats away, a woman in a navy blue blazer squeezed the photo of her deployed husband just a little tighter. Moments later, Representative Johnson raised concerns about the disruption to military children's education, pointing out how frequent moves combined with stalled promotions made stability nearly impossible. Tuberville waved him off with the casual remark, "Moving around builds character." It was the kind of folksy line that might have earned applause at a campaign rally, but here it landed like an insult. Parents in the gallery exchanged glances. They knew firsthand the tears that came with uprooted friendships, missed milestones, and classrooms left behind. Each quip chipped away at the patience in the room. What Tuberville framed as wit, families experienced as dismissal, and with every shrug and smirk, the gulf between his rhetoric and their lived reality grew wider. By the time Crockett adjusted her microphone, the frustration was almost tangible. You could feel it in the way the gallery leaned forward, in the silence that suddenly fell as conversations hushed, in the way even staffers stopped tapping notes to watch what was about to unfold. Tuberville, meanwhile, seemed perfectly at ease. He leaned back in his chair, the same smirk he had worn all morning tugging at his mouth, confident that he could deflect whatever came his way. To him, it was just another skirmish, another opportunity to flash his good old boy charm and turn serious concerns into casual banter. But this wasn't going to be like the others. Unlike Martinez or Johnson, Crockett carried more than statistics and talking points. She carried the weight of a family's service, the voice of a father who had seen combat, and the quiet fury of military families tired of being treated like pawns. The air in the room shifted as she prepared to speak. The turning point had arrived, and everyone knew it, even if Tuberville didn't. When Jasmine Crockett finally adjusted her microphone, the energy in the hearing room shifted. She didn't waste words on pleasantries. Her voice was steady, clipped with the precision of someone who had prepared for this exact exchange. "Senator Tuberville," she began, "can you explain to the military families watching at home why their loved ones are being denied promotions because of your personal political agenda?" The question was sharp and direct, cutting through the procedural language that usually padded congressional hearings. For families in the gallery, it was the question they had been asking for months. Why were their careers, benefits, and futures being held hostage? Tuberville leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk stretching across his face. He exhaled, slowly, savoring the moment as though he were back on a football field with cameras rolling. "Well, Congresswoman," he drawled, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure someone who's never been around military folks would understand the complex decisions we have to make here." A few quiet chuckles from his side of the aisle punctuated the remark. To Tuberville, it was a small victory. He had planted the seed of doubt, painting Crockett as inexperienced, detached from the realities of service. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle her papers or stumble over a rebuttal. She met his eyes and replied evenly, "With all due respect, Senator, Coaching football is not the same as serving in combat. And making decisions that hurt military families isn't supporting the troops, it's using them as political pawns. The room tightened. The gallery sat forward in their seats. Tuberville's face reddened slightly, but he pushed on, unwilling to surrender ground. "Now hold on there," he shot back. "I've spent my whole career around warriors, real warriors. Maybe if you spent less time in courtrooms and more time with actual service members, you'd understand what we're dealing with here." It was the line he had been waiting to use, the one that drew a clear line between his version of toughness and hers. He expected it to silence her, to remind the room of his authority. Instead, it backfired. Crockett's tone sharpened. Her words landed like steel. "Senator, you may have been on the sidelines, but you've never been in the trenches. And the families sitting behind us today don't need folksy metaphors. They need leadership. They need stability. They need respect." Tuberville leaned back further, lips curling into what he thought was a clever smile. And then it came. The laugh. Loud, dismissive, echoing across the chamber like a coach mocking a rookie. It wasn't the chuckle of amusement. It was the laugh of condescension. The kind that said, "You don't belong here." The sound cut through the room like a blade. Conversations stopped. Pens hovered mid-air. Reporters glanced at each other, sensing they had just witnessed the spark that would ignite something far bigger. For Crockett, the laugh was the final straw. Her demeanor changed. In an instant. Gone was the measured attorney building her case with calm precision. In its place emerged something sharper, more personal. A daughter channeling the lessons of a father who had bled for his country. "Something funny, Senator?" she asked, her voice low but electric. The laugh still lingered in the air, but Tuberville's grin had already begun to fade. He didn't know it yet, but that single laugh had shifted the entire hearing. What had been a sparring match of words was about to become a reckoning. The moment Tuberville's mocking laugh faded, Jasmine Crockett's expression hardened. Gone was the careful, methodical attorney building her case step by step. In her place stood a daughter carrying the weight of 22 years of military sacrifice. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and reached into the folder sitting in front of her. "Senator Tuberville," she said, her voice cutting clean through the silence. "Since you find my military knowledge so amusing, I'd like to share something with you and with everyone watching at home." From the folder, she drew a sealed envelope. The room shifted instantly. Reporters leaned forward. Staffers put down their pens. The quiet became absolute. "This," she continued, holding the envelope steady, "is a letter from my father, Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force, retired. A man who served 3 tours in Vietnam, earned the Bronze Star, and taught me what it really means to serve your country." Tuberville's grin wavered. For the first time that morning, he realized he had no idea what was coming. Crockett unfolded the letter carefully, her hands steady. When she began to read, her voice carried not just her own authority, but the weight of decades of service. "To Senator Tommy Tuberville," she read, "I am Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force, retired. Your recent actions and comments have deeply insulted every service member and every military family in this country." The words landed like hammer blows. The gallery was frozen, every eye locked on the Congresswoman. Gold Star mothers clutched. Photographs. Veterans sat straighter in their seats. "My daughter knows," she continued, "that when you block military promotions, you aren't making a political point. You are destroying careers men and women have spent decades building. You are hurting children whose parents cannot plan their futures. You are turning honorable service into uncertainty and burden." Tuberville shifted in his seat, his face pale. The smirk was gone. "My daughter knows these things because I taught her," Crockett read. "I taught her after returning from 3 tours in Vietnam, after burying friends and writing letters to mothers who would never see their sons again. Service is not a slogan, Senator. Service is sacrifice." There were muffled sobs in the gallery now. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Reporters sat motionless, their usual whispering silenced by the raw power of the words. "Senator," the letter continued, "you coached football for 30 years and I respect that. But coaching young men to play a game is not the same as leading young men into combat. It is not the same as holding a dying soldier in your arms. It is not the same as carrying the weight of lives lost under your command." Crockett's voice grew stronger as she pressed forward, her father's words hitting like artillery. "You want to know what real military knowledge looks like, Senator? It looks like understanding that every promotion you block represents a family's future. Every delay ripples across communities. Every game you play with policy leaves real families in fear and uncertainty. The chamber was utterly silent, save for her steady voice. Tuberville sat rigid, gripping the edge of the table. His earlier confidence evaporated. My daughter doesn't just understand military life because she studied it, the letter went on. She understands it because she lived it, watching her mother worry each day for 22 years whether I would come home alive, moving base to base, growing up with the reality of sacrifice. She carries more understanding in her little finger than you have shown in your entire political career. At this, Crockett paused and looked directly at Tuberville before delivering the final blow. Senator, when you laughed at my daughter's military knowledge, you didn't just mock her. You mocked every military family in America. You mocked every veteran who fought for your right to sit in that chair. And you mocked every service member who even now puts their life on the line while you play politics with their careers. The faux letter closed with one line that seemed to reverberate through the chamber. Remember this, Senator. Some of us earned our knowledge of service through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, not through coaching football and making political speeches. Signed simply, Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force, retired. Proud father of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The room stayed silent. Reporters didn't type. Politicians didn't whisper. Even the air felt heavy, as though everyone present recognized they had just witnessed something historic. Tuberville sat motionless, the color drained from his face. What had begun with a mocking laugh ended with the crushing voice of lived sacrifice, an authority no soundbite, no smirk, no football story could compete with. For a long moment after the final line of Master Sergeant Crockett's letter, the hearing room sat in absolute silence. No shuffling of papers, no coughs, even the cameras seemed frozen. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, the kind that follows a truth so sharp it leaves no space for rebuttal. Tuberville, once leaning back smugly in his chair, now sat rigid. His lips parted as though he might speak, but no words came. Finally, with a voice stripped of its earlier swagger, he managed, I have great respect for your father's service. I never meant to. Crockett didn't let him finish. You never meant to what, Senator? She pressed, her voice suddenly razor-sharp. You never meant to laugh? You never meant to dismiss military families? You never meant to use your position to play politics with people's lives? Her words cut across the chamber and the silence deepened again. Tuberville's face flushed red, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Whatever defense he had rehearsed, whatever talking point he might have leaned on, was gone. He had nothing. The hearing adjourned soon after, but the confrontation didn't end in that room. Within minutes, clips of Crockett reading the letter began spreading online. The exact moment Tuberville laughed, the smirk frozen on his face, was paired with the devastating lines from her father's words. The internet did the rest. By the end of the day, the hashtag Master Sergeant Crockett letter was trending across platforms. Military families shared their own stories of canceled promotions, postponed retirements, and the ripple effects Tuberville had dismissed as inconveniences. Gold Star mothers reposted the clip with captions like, "This is what respect looks like." Active duty service members, some still in uniform, quietly pushed the video to private groups and forums, writing that Crockett's father had finally said what they had been feeling all along. The media response was swift. Cable news replayed the exchange in full, often without commentary, letting the power of the letter speak for itself. Headlines in major papers framed the clash not as Democrat versus Republican, but as authenticity versus theater. One outlet called it a collision between lived service and borrowed credibility. Behind the scenes, Republican strategists scrambled. How do you spin mocking a Vietnam veteran's daughter on military issues? How do you counter the words of a man with 3 tours, a Bronze Star, and 2 decades of service? Attack lines that worked in other fights fell flat here. Even conservative commentators who usually defended Tuberville found themselves pivoting to safer ground, unwilling to publicly challenge the moral authority of Master Sergeant Crockett's letter. Democrats, on the other hand, wasted no time elevating Jasmine Crockett. Overnight, she went from a sharp freshman lawmaker to a powerful new voice on military and veterans issues. Advocacy groups began calling her office, eager to work with someone who not only knew the policies, but understood the lived sacrifices behind them. For Tuberville, the damage was unmistakable. His laugh, intended to belittle, had become the defining image of his career. For Crockett, her father's letter had become something greater than a rebuttal. It was a turning point, a declaration that respect for service is not a slogan, and that arrogance has consequences when confronted with authentic sacrifice. In the days and weeks that followed, the impact of Master Sergeant Crockett's letter only grew. What had begun as a tense committee hearing turned into a defining moment in American politics. The clip spread far beyond the walls of Washington. It became a cultural touchstone, a reminder of the difference between talking about sacrifice and living it. For Senator Tuberville, the consequences were immediate and lasting. His political brand, built on the image of a straight-talking defender of military values, was suddenly hollow. The mocking laugh that once seemed like confidence became a symbol of arrogance. His credibility on military issues collapsed, even among some allies who had supported his standoff over promotions. One by one, colleagues began distancing themselves, leaving him increasingly isolated. For Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the opposite was true. Her father's words elevated her voice far beyond the House floor. She became a champion for military families, not just because of policy expertise but because of lived experience. Advocacy groups that had long struggled to be heard now had a lawmaker they trusted to carry their stories. Overnight, she became not just a rising star, but a voice of moral authority. The ripple effects didn't stop there. Military academies and ethics programs quickly seized on the exchange as a case study. Cadets were shown the clip as a lesson in the difference between assumed authority and earned credibility. Veterans organizations used the letter as a rallying cry to push back against political games that put service members' lives in limbo. Even international allies noticed, with military attachés abroad remarking on how the moment underscored America's respect for service when it was voiced authentically. The hearing room confrontation came to symbolize something larger than two politicians sparring. It became a dividing line between performance and principle, between rhetoric and sacrifice. It reminded the country that military families carry stories and burdens politicians cannot afford to dismiss, and that when those voices speak, they deserve silence, not laughter. At its core, the moral was clear. Lived service carries a weight political theater can never imitate. No speech, no slogan, no campaign rally can compete with the authority of a veteran who has bled, sweated, and sacrificed for their country. Tuberville's laugh may have sparked the confrontation, but it was Master Sergeant Crockett's letter that finished it, with words that will echo long after the hearing is forgotten. And for viewers, this is just one of many battles shaping the soul of American politics today. Authentic service versus political posturing. Truth versus theater. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next moment where real voices cut through the noise. Because if this confrontation proved anything, it's that truth and sacrifice still matter more than arrogance and gamesmanship.